Hi everyone. I know not everyone was here to cover the American imperialism notes. Just as a reminder, we do fill in the blank notes in class. Maybe you lost yours, maybe you were gone for various reasons. I always post the assignments on the Teams page, so you're welcome to go on there. Obviously, you're doing it if you're watching it here. And of course, hit that subscribe button and hit the like button. You don't have to do that. That was just a request from a student. Let's talk about imperialism. If you've ever seen Star Wars, the bad guys, Darth Vader, all those people, they're all about creating an empire. That means not only controlling their home area, but having all of these additional territories that they're going to have under their own control. In other words, imperialism is building an empire by creating colonies or conquering other lands. Now, for that to happen, you have to have an effective military. When you look at U.S. history, we originally started as 13 colonies, and we spread, in some cases because of finances. We bought the Louisiana Purchase. In some cases, we actually went to war, like our conquest of northern Mexico after the Mexican-American War. That's going to happen once the U.S. develops enough military power to do so. So imperialism really only occurs when a country is strong enough and has the money to build a decent military to get what they want. And this is all part of the time of the changing American policies from the days of George Washington. Now, we know Washington was an isolationist. It means he felt that America was so small and weak, we needed to stay out of European affairs. We needed to stay completely focused on internal matters and not get sucked into a war where we would most definitely lose. But by the 1820s, American self-identity is changing. We just beat the British, at least we thought, in the War of 1812, and we're beginning to feel a little more powerful. So in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine is issued. It's a policy that's telling these European powers like Britain, like France, like Spain, Germany, that they are to remain uninvolved and not to colonize in any of the Americas, South or Central America. Now, if you have a colony, fine, we're not going to force you to evacuate. But a lot of places like Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru in the 1820s had gained their independence from Spain and other countries. And we were telling them, if you get involved in the Americas, we're going to take that as a direct threat on our national security, even though we really don't have a lot of power to enforce it. In our last unit, we talked about the Industrial Revolution, how there's a growing need for new markets overseas. That's going to lead to this American imperialism. And if you recall, in 7th grade, we covered in the westward expansion the idea of manifest destiny. It's the belief that if we're going to expand our territory, it's most importantly because it is God's will. It's an inevitable decision. It is this plan of God that kind of excuses us from responsibility of actually taking that from other people, Native Americans, and the like. We're going to see it in Japan. Commodore Perry is essentially going to threaten the Japanese into trading with them. Alaska will purchase from Russia. So it's not always about military force, but by the point where we have the military in order to force this, we also have the economy in order to buy land. We're going to conquer and annex, that means take Hawaii. And in order to support our military expansion, we have a global navy. We're building more modern ships. But we are developing this conflict with Spain, and we're beginning to see in Cuba, for example, which at the time as part of the Spanish Empire was fighting for its independence against the Spanish overlords, and the Spanish are being pretty brutal in order to control them. Now, the U.S. begins to see this as an opportunity to apply that Monroe Doctrine I talked about earlier. Europe, stay out of the Americas if you're not wanted. American companies also wanted better access to the markets, and that's going to put a lot of pressure in to go to war. But one of the things that we tend to see a rise of is newspapers pushing hard in order to get this war happening. Newspapers and reporters who sensationalize, focus on these extravagant stories of abuse by the Spanish, distort stories in order to sell newspapers, and they're almost entirely anti-Spanish. It makes the Spanish look like oppressors, like bullies. And when we talk about yellow journalism, obviously headlines like this are, we would call it clickbait today, the idea of getting people's attention being shocking. And people will buy that. Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, two competing newspapers that would issue more and more extravagant stories about the Spanish. Now, One of the bigger issues was in 1898 in February, the U.S. sends one of our ships, it was heavy cruiser Maine, into Havana Harbor. One night it explodes, and the Spanish are immediately believed to be responsible. We begin to see newspaper publications like this: "Crisis is at hand," "Spanish treachery," making it sound like the Spanish have stabbed us in the back and blown it up. Unless you go back and read it again. Crisis is at hand. Cabinet in session, growing belief in Spanish treachery. And yet the growing belief part is small. That's the yellow journalism we're seeing. It's trying to push for this war. Well, they succeed. Remember the Maine becomes a battle cry, and in April, war is declared. Around the same time, Congress is trying to show that we're a democratic-focused nation, so we pass the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment says we don't want to take control of Cuba. We're not planning to be bullies and take this colony of Cuba to be an American territory. Within 4 months, we crush the old Spanish military. We gain Cuba, Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. Almost 9 million new people are now under the direct control of the U.S. government. By the end of the war, there is this view by Americans that the war has been good for us. This little girl here represents Cuba. You can tell based on her crown that says Cuba. You have these two Americans, one in a Confederate uniform, one in a Union uniform, showing that Americans have finally put the Civil War behind them and broken her bonds. As you can see, she's got the bonds right here that have been broken, the chains. Emilio Aguinaldo would disagree. He is a Philippine general, and he sees the U.S. as a conqueror, an enemy. But it doesn't matter. The Philippines are going to be like Guam and lands like Puerto Rico, territories. These are lands that aren't states, but they do have control by the U.S. government. That is a territory. Heroes like Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, will eventually catapult him to the presidency. But as you're looking at the map here, you can see American interest. All the islands it's taking, and just like we've talked about in class before, if you pay attention to where it's heading to, I'll be darned, it's going to China. That has been the U.S. foreign policy, especially when it comes to the Pacific, for many decades. And by 1898, we essentially have our stepping stones all the way to trade with China. But the U.S. policy is also changing in terms of how we view those other countries that we are now taking as territories. We issue the Platt Amendment, which actually limits what Cuban governments can do, the treaties they can make, the decisions they can make, and it says the U.S. can intervene whenever they want. Obviously, again, you're going to see in the Philippines people like Aguinaldo not happy about that. Not all Americans are on board with it. Some people called anti-imperialists, anti means against, want a new chance to review how Americans are acquiring these lands. If you buy them, if the people willingly come into the American sphere of influence, that's great. Conquering lands and making them American is seen as inappropriate anti-American to these anti-imperialists. Asia. We've talked about that movement, especially in the Pacific, to take the lands. China is, of course, the goal. Raw materials, raw resources, tons of new customers for U.S. markets. As I previously mentioned, Japan pretty much had its doors forced open for trade by the United States in the 1850s, before the Civil War. China's a little different. Europe had been in China for many years, and they had acquired what's called spheres of influence. Those are areas where each of the European powers holds sway. So in southern China, the French had huge amount of control. Central China, we see the British had established many inroads and largely dominated the economy and the government. Japan up north, Russia, of course, along their frontier. Those are spheres of influence. The idea is within each sphere, Britain is the only one that's really going to be allowed access. Well, like anything else, America's not down with that. So we have the open door policy. It's going to be where the U.S. advocates barrier-free trading. We say spheres of influence, we're going to ignore them. We want to trade with whoever we wish, and we will. Teddy Roosevelt extends that after President McKinley had started that. Obviously, the Chinese are not happy with the spheres of influence, and America also trying to get in and dominate and control their politics and their economy. There's a revolution called the Boxer Rebellion. Western militaries, the U.S., Europe, quickly send their militaries in, subdue the rebels, and restore control over that economy and government in China. We see in these political cartoons here, you have Uncle Sam with the Chinese person smiling, forcing with its army and its navy the doors open to China, sort of blocking those spheres of influence and saying that America will trade with whoever we want, whenever we want. But America has its own sphere of influence. It's the Americas. We have enormous influence over Central and South America, originally because of the Monroe Doctrine. But as our economy gets larger, as our military gets larger, as you can see, we're in Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. We're fighting battles and intervening directly in the government in many situations, from 1898 really through the 1930s. We actually take the Monroe Doctrine and we amend it. We modify it. It's called the Roosevelt Corollary. We say, yes, if Europe gets involved, we're going to take that as a threat on our national security. But the U.S. could actually actively intervene in Latin America, almost like a police force, to stop wrongdoing or in order to put situations we deem as not advantageous to the residents or to American businesses, and we can step in and stop wrongdoing. So the Roosevelt Corollary takes the Monroe Doctrine, which was sort of a protective measure, and it says the U.S. isn't just going to protect from without, it will directly get involved within and take over. We now become the cop. And as you can see the image here, America is the largest character there. We now see ourselves as a dominant world power. That's different than what we covered in 7th grade. Only in Puerto Rico, however, were natives actually made into citizens. The other natives, it would be a long time before they get their citizenship recognized. Now, the U.S., as I've said earlier, uses its military to expand and spread its influence and increase its territories. But we also use our money. President William Howard Taft uses what's called dollar diplomacy. Essentially, we use but we use economic aid. We use companies in order to send money and resources in order to kind of influence those countries. The Mexican Revolution is going on. A revolution in Mexico is worrying American businesses. We're becoming worried that Germany's getting involved in this revolution. We even invade Mexico to stop people like Pancho Villa that had been raiding north of the border. Eventually, the revolution is successful for people like Zapata, Pancho Villa, and Carranza. U.S. troops would withdraw, but we would still have some limited control over Central and South America. But there's always the dream of getting to China. The long way around is South America, going around Chile and Argentina. It adds weeks to the journey. We decide we're going to cut that just a bit. And so essentially we're going to take the narrowest part of Panama and we are going to create a system where ships can sail through Panama to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. There's a series of, as one of the students called it, water elevators that are going to be used in order to raise the ship so that they can get from one end to the other. The U.S. essentially creates a revolution in Panama. The new Panamanian government gives the U.S. whatever it wants once it's been separated from Colombia, and we get control over that region, and we build that Panama Canal. It takes 10 years. 6,000 people are going to die from disease and accidents. But in 1914, the U.S. now has prime real estate for connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, just in time for World War I, which we're going to cover in our next set of notes. Any questions? Let me just remind you, Chapter 22 in your textbook has a lot of this. Feel free to take a look at it and come see me if you have any questions. Stay on top of your work and make sure you're doing that study guide. Have a great day.